All right. To the folks online, we forgot to say hello. So hello, welcome. And thank you all for being here. Wonderful panelists, I'm so happy to have you. Could we just get a couple of introductions going? Maybe we'll start with you, Liz, and then work our way this way.
Yeah, I'm Liz Lopatto. I am a senior reporter at The Verge. I cover business, which means I cover a little bit of everything. The Verge, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a publication that focuses on tech.
So I'm Susanne Grooms. I'm a partner at Cooley. I lead our congressional investigations practice. Worked in Congress for a long time doing congressional investigations. Now work in a practice defending companies and individuals when they get inquiries from Congress, as well as a variety of other crisis management political investigations.
Hi, I'm Lauren Tilstra. I currently lead communications and marketing for the World Bank Group, but spent about 20 years working in the private sector across entertainment and telecommunications.
So happy to be here with everybody. I'm Kelly Sullivan. I'm a partner at Joele, the financial communications firm that has an office in both San Francisco and New York, and proudly partners with Cooley and many of the other people in the room here today. So happy to be here.
Well, I'm so excited about this conversation because when we were initially planning it, we were like, let's just talk about all the things we've seen so far on like Instagram and Twitter, and I really would love to do that, but this is, after all, a little bit more academic than that. So I wanted to first start with the idea that reputation was once seen as something that was a byproduct of being in the limelight, but now it's become a sort of strategy. For decades, the attention was mostly on corporate brands, maybe their products or the company's reputation as a whole. But I want to say in the past about 3 or 4, even 5 years, especially this year, there's a focus on the individual executive, whether that's their values, their politics, their behavior, their public persona. Maybe they're not even who they are at home, on stage. But it's somewhat become inseparable from the company's reputation. And that's why that topic is happening in this conversation. That's why we're talking about it as part of corporate governance. So my goal is to have all of you join us on a ride as we walk through behind the scenes of how executives and their teams really think about reputation as not just something that is a risk to be managed, but perhaps a strategy to be deployed. So Liz, I wanted to start with you. We talked about this a bit, this notion of the celebrity CEO, which, you know, the ignorant me is like, well, everyone wants just to like put their name on things and the ego. But it's not so much just that. The celebrity CEO has become a sort of strategy. So can you just walk us through how we went from having CEOs behind the scenes to now CEOs being so celebrity?
Yeah, so this sort of starts in the 1980s, where you see the rise of CEOs as sort of celebrities in the Wall Street Journal specifically, which makes sense, it's for the business community. But you have people like Jack Welch emerging as like spokespeople for not just for their company and their company's values, but as a kind of like marketing tool. And then going forward, you see Steve Jobs in the late 90s, early 2000s, really identifying himself with the Apple brand. And it's a huge marketing tool, right? Like, people start watching product announcements, which was unusual at the time. That was kind of a thing for nerds, but because Steve Jobs was kind of a rock star, people tuned in. And so that, I think, was the pivotal moment where we sort of shifted to the landscape where we're at now. Obviously, Steve Jobs is no longer with us. And after he died, Elon Musk sort of picked up the banner of celebrity CEO. And for those of you who are not familiar with the history of Tesla, when Musk became the CEO, it was like teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. It did not have money to spend on marketing. And because Musk was a celebrity, because he was associated with Robert Downey Jr. in particular, who had followed him around for the Iron Man role, that was something that they could use to market their cars without having to ever place an ad. And that's still something Tesla does today. So for instance, if you remember a couple of years ago, Musk was on Saturday Night Live. He was the show. And every car maker was paying for the ads in between Musk, right? That's the origin of this strategy. It's a way of getting media attention that does not rely on an outlay of money.
And I would say we see this in kind of a microcosm in venture capital where the personality and like the gravitas of a CEO can actually be considered, at least in both the valuation or the series rounds that they're trying to raise. So I think personality plays a larger role strategically than I think we realize. So I was hoping we could actually put this a little bit into practice. So Kelly, this is a question for you. Let's actually walk through how a CEO's activities might unfold in public, okay? Whether that's like speaking on a topic about tariffs or maybe pricing strategies or something that's happening in their supply chain. As they're making these decisions to speak out publicly about operational to political to any of these topics, what's actually happening in the room and who's advising them? What are they saying?
Yeah, I think it's such a real life example that so many companies have wrestled with. And I just want to pick up a good point that Liz made, which is I think the way this kind of celebrity, high profile CEO started, was intentional. And I think unfortunately we're in a media moment where there aren't enough Liz's anymore. So, if you're a high profile, large cap company, you're still getting a ton of coverage. But for other companies, they've really had to create their own news cycle. And I think when you now have the ability, having done that, you really do have more levers to pull when you want to do something like maybe comment on tariffs. And I think in terms of who's in the room, it's most of the people in this room, right? It's your general counsel, it's your communications advisor, and then importantly, government relations. Because I think when you think about a company weighing in on tariffs, I think that's a great example of a CEO using, his voice to weigh in a topic that meets the mission and values of the company. I think when we've talked about where maybe things have been more challenging for some leaders, you got to pick your lane. And if your voice is maybe as a CEO disconnected from your business mission, you may not be serving your shareholders well.
I think picking your lane and kind of having your message strategy, I love that point because there's a lot that can go wrong. Recently, I had a tech CEO reputation, similar conversation on this, and often there's a contention that what may be legal may not be necessarily sexy in the news, or like what may be vetted by your lawyers may not necessarily translate to your stakeholders. Lauren, maybe this is a question for you as someone who's advised on a number of these and been in the position to have to make these calls in your private sector roles and now at World Bank Group. What does an executive not see at the moment that they're deciding to make a statement? I mean, I'm sure it's like a ton of things, but I would just love to get a little bit of those out there.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you kind of have to take a step back. So first you have to ask the question is the executive, where are they in their life cycle as a CEO? You see a lot of times when a new executive comes in, they're very bullish, they're building a team that's competitive, fit to win, right? And so they're more accustomed to putting constructive dissent into their leadership team, and so you have that nice tension where you're able to say, yes, we're doing this, no, we're not doing this. But what you see a lot of times is, or at least in my experience, not 100%, but you see that over time, CEOs end up with people who say yes a lot. And so you almost have to ask the question of who is in the room, to Kelly's point, in the life cycle of a CEO. And then from there, figuring out what things are pet projects, what things are good for the business, what things kind of flow through the code of conduct, so to say, like that are critical to the business itself. And so you almost have to ask yourself the question first of how is a CEO getting advised? So that's kind of part one. Part two is how does a CEO define what their core stakeholders, who their core stakeholders are? And so that can evolve over time, but if there isn't clarity, as somebody who's been in the room for these things, if there isn't clarity from the onset of who your kind of 4 key stakeholders or 3 key stakeholders are, you find that a lot of times there's bias in the decision making because a CEO might feel one way or another. And so that's a lot of it has to do, we're at a corporate governance conference, a lot of it has to do with the governance of the decision making itself and defining kind of the who are the key players, who are the people who are actively gonna say no, and is a CEO willing to accept that as part of the process?
As I'm like imagining what you're saying, one of the things that I find if I were in the CEO's shoes that I would find challenging is how to be authentic in all of that, right? Because there's so many, these are not the right ways to do it, these are the right ways to do it, here's your little tiny lane on which you need to walk. And this is a question for anyone on the stage or all of you, but how have you found, at least the CEOs that you advise, remain authentic? Because I think that's possibly where a lot of the constituency that you're trying to
point, right? Because we know that authenticity equals credibility. So a CEO, any leader who's speaking with authenticity is going to have a faster path to achieving their communications goals. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot with the advent of CEOs leaning in more to LinkedIn, right? Like I think the press release is starting to disappear, and it's much more interesting to hear a CEO to read a CEO's letter to employees that they post on LinkedIn than it is to digest their quote from a press release. So I think there's just more and more awareness of that.
Liz, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
I mean, one of the things that I look for is I mostly ignore CEO quotes and press releases. I'm just going to be very honest with all of you, all right? Because I know those have been vetted by lawyers, and frankly, they're just not very interesting. And when I think about quotes, what I'm thinking about is something that conveys emotion or personality. And you're more likely to find that in communications with employees, an interview, or some sort of unguarded moment where the person is speaking as themselves. And one of the things that is like really very telling is, are they speaking in layperson's language or not? Because if there's all this jargon, I know it went through a lawyer and it doesn't sound like a person said it.
That's very helpful, and I want to stick to you a little bit because, great, so we now know that authenticity is like the solution to all problems. And then, that's just me being very simplistic, but I want to talk about a viral moment then, because that's where you get into some gray areas. We've seen the hat thief CEO being authentic and wanting, like, childlike to grab the, whatever, it was a tennis ball or something, or a hat, I don't know. The astronomer CEO being authentic. University presidents. These are all moments of vulnerability and authenticity, and sometimes those people are not out there like, yeah, this is my public statement to the world. It's just existence. So what makes a statement go from just a statement or lived experience to virality?
I think in the cases that you're citing, it feels like we're getting a glimpse of who this person actually is that's really different from the manufactured and responsible persona, right? You're seeing somebody misbehave, and that's always fascinating. I don't know about the rest of you, but that's part of the reason I'm in this business. And so there is something to that, but when you're talking about authenticity and being authentic, you need to be authentic to who this person is. And I'm going to come back to Elon Musk, who has misbehaved in public a lot. I was at his defamation trial. Misbehaving is a big part of who he is. And it's one of the reasons that people think he's authentic, because he's never pretended not to misbehave. There's never been a moment where he's pretended to be a normal CEO. So in some ways, that's really protective in a way that somebody who takes the stage and seems to be really responsible and then is later found at a Coldplay concert with somebody who's not his wife, might struggle with.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think this is not an easy kind of composition of what goes from statement to virality. So I invite other panelists to also walk in and tell us where you've seen examples of were you just commenting on like, hey, we had like a small supply chain disruption here, but suddenly it becomes a viral moment? I'm curious to know when like it becomes a strategy problem, like where your business gets implicated. So I mean, I invite any of you to.
I mean, a lot of companies have faced this in terms of, getting the president's attention in the wrong way, right? And all of a sudden, it's a business issue because you have shareholders who are concerned that you won't be able to execute your business because you're now the target of, 9 Truth Social posts that are like hard to decipher, and how do you walk that back? And so I do think you're seeing CEOs, especially on issues that impact policy and politics, be more thoughtful, be more measured, and that is where I think they're relying more on their advisors, not to like over polish it, but to really make sure we have an off ramp, right? And I think we've seen some of this with some of the CEOs who are headquartered in New York City in terms of how they want to talk about who the next mayor might be, right? That they might not be giving their full-throated endorsement, but they're making it really clear that whoever is mayor, they're going to work with, because that's their job as a leader in the city, is to work with whoever's mayor.
Yeah, I think you also want to think about where you go in the line. And so if you kind of go back to like where I feel like the perma crisis almost started was like when we started, we had Charlottesville, and then we had Black Lives Matter, and then it turned into COVID. Like that era feels like when we hit that, everything has been a perma crisis kind of since then. And so whether you're sitting 2 blocks from the White House, like I am in my current role, or you're sitting, in New York in a mayoral race like Kelly just mentioned, I think it also matters from a strategy perspective where your CEO goes in line. And that's where kind of advisory comes in. It's knowing when is it like a strategic imperative to be out of the gate first so that you set the narrative, and where is it more prudent to come in to wait to see what others do. And so, and it can be a double-edged sword. If you go out too soon, then you're kind of at like the fluff level where it's just words, and maybe Liz picks it up and says, okay, so where's the actual meat in this? But then there's also, if you wait too long, then are you just following the crowd, but maybe you've got more meat on the bone. And so finding that sweet spot is often one of the bigger challenges, but also one of the reasons why, people like us stay gainfully employed, because figuring out that like delicate line can be the difference between a reputational just downfall and somebody really popping into kind of the virality piece of it.
And we spend a lot of time, obviously I'm the lawyer, right? We spend a lot of time trying to mitigate that legal risk and not end up exciting Liz, and generally avoid her, and generally stay a little bit boring, which is often real positive, really into boring, but still be able to make statements in a way that you feel serves your audience. So as you were talking about, the most important thing to be thinking about is who's your audience, who are you speaking to? Who matters, right? Of course we're mitigating legal risk, right? That's like the baseline. Can't be over-lawyered, can't sound like we're mitigating legal risk, but often we do that. We can do this. We can all work together and help you sort of solve this problem. It is not impossible. We just reduce some of the factual statements when you don't know the actual answers, right? We reduce some of the strongly worded assertions and ease them down a little to mitigate that legal risk when you don't want to lean out because you're not really sure or you haven't vetted it, et cetera, right? And then we work with the comms team to get it into layperson's terms where the message that you're giving is actually going to be well received by the audience that you want to receive it, which can be your employees, and it can be your customer base, and it can be Congress, and it can be the president. And so as you're doing it, often I find that sort of the statements that are most impactful are ones with, especially in crisis, emergency issues, less about, here's actually what happened and here's all the answers, because we don't even really know that yet. And if we do, we're not 100% sure it's right yet. But are emotive, right? We recognize this as an issue. We care about this issue. We are working on this. We are going to get back to you. those kinds of messages where really you're expressing your authenticity, you're expressing the values of your company, but you're not leaning too far out on the legal side.
I think where companies have done this really well in terms of partnership too with legal is when they've taken a moment to actually be intentional about where they're going to play, right? And so I think Lauren's right that we went through this moment where everybody was in crisis and you had employees who were begging their CEOs to weigh in on every topic, and that went too far. But I also hear from a lot of CEOs who don't like this idea that, you know, they've been put in a box, right? And that they're not being a part of the conversation. And you now have scenarios where, because of this broader reputational risk, not to the CEO, but to the company, you have boards who kind of want to play in this space and know what the CEO is planning. So I think companies who take a moment and say, we're a media company, we're not in the climate change fight. We wish our employees who want to be active there well, but we are in the media business, and First Amendment, free speech, those go to our values, they go to the core of our business. We're going to be ready to weigh in where needed there. And I think that's important because as much as there's been this idea that everybody's pulling back on weighing in, you know, we're still in a moment where, like, the people younger than me are really making a lot of decisions about where they work based on the values of that organization. And they don't want to necessarily work somewhere that's just, you know, like the white cube, and they don't have a sense of what they stand for.
Well, or where they shop, right?
Yeah.
You're seeing a lot of influencers now drive decision making on consumer habits based on company values, based on previous statements, things like that, which is really critical.
The other thing is, you know, I understand that I'm the most visible person who's got a bullshit detector, but like your audience has a bullshit detector too, okay? I am in some ways a stand-in for those people. If you're weighing in on something that doesn't make sense as a priority for your company or for your brand, but happens to just sort of be in the news in the moment, people can tell. And like, I might be the person writing about it, but in some ways, I'm just confirming what people can plainly see.
Well, yeah, like Bumble did this really well, right?
Yep.
When they weighed in on, you know, issues of like inappropriate posting of pictures and targeting women, like that was a great place for them to like own a lane. It connected to their brand. It spoke to their customers. You know, it made people want to work there, and like it really worked so well.
Right, and conversely, Target, which for many years, you know, like celebrated Gay Pride Month, like made a big deal out of it. Like the Trump administration rolls in, and suddenly they're rolling back their diversity initiatives, and like, oh, there's not really a gay pride display this year. Like, people notice that, and that's hit Target's bottom line.
Absolutely. Everything communicates. Your silence sometimes speaks way louder than your words.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the question I have, which is like, how can, what if it is, you know, in that moment, whether that's your CEO or another executive in the company may not have spoken prior on certain issues, but maybe they are moved. Maybe they want to make a moment of say like, this is who we are now. Is there a place for that?
Yeah, but that's, when I say who you surround yourself with matters, when you take up the role as chairman and CEO, I mean, we're in a room of lawyers, right? There's a fiduciary responsibility to the company, right? Or to the organization. And so in some respects, when you sign on the dotted line that you want that job, you become the ambassador of that brand, of their value set, of, you know, speaking through their code of conduct or their credo or whatever they call it, right? And so that's where advisory comes in, right? Because sometimes as a CEO, you have to keep your personal. That's part of the gig you sign up for. And so I think that's where this kind of virality conversation gets a little funky, because sometimes CEOs, turns out, are humans too. And so advice is just that, it's advice. Whether or not a principal takes it is a very different
very different story. And so I think that's all part of it.
Well, like even on the point of, virality in terms of media and like social media and things like that, but now in 2025, I think there's a larger stakeholder. And Susan, this is a question for you. Like, when does a viral moment get Congress calling? I mean, when do you get pulled in?
Quickly. So, members of Congress are reading the news, their staff's reading the news, they see the story, they say, that's interesting, and they write a letter. That happens every day. Depends on the speed of the person writing the letter. Could be same day, could be within a week, but often the letter from somebody in Congress, or if you're operating on a different scale, a local political leader, can be one of the sort of first things that you see out of the gate. And then we work a lot with parallel investigations. The other government investigations start rolling through, but takes them like a couple extra minutes, because obviously writing a quick letter that's public that says, hey, tell me everything you've been doing is not that difficult. And so, I think that it can happen very quickly, but you don't need to respond immediately. Right? That's really the difference with the Congress. Like, you need to have your press response. That has to happen immediately, whatever your press response is. And you get a little bit more time to sort of digest and think about how you want to strategize on the response to Congress. And of course, when we talk about Congress, it's not a monolith. It's many, many different members with many, many different authorities and many different practices. And so we help clients evaluate between, who you're getting requests from and how you would respond to that request. A chairman with unilateral subpoena authority, you're probably going to give them a lot more information than a minority member who's of the minority party, who is not likely to get up any power anytime soon and doesn't really have a great public platform, right? Just less of a risk there. So anyway, yeah.
Well, I just, as like a member of the public, when someone says this company is getting investigated by Congress, in my head, it's like, whoa, they're bad people, right? Like in my head, it's scary. So I just love to get other voices in and say, like, is it already too late at that point when you're sitting like the Capitol Hill, like pleading your case, or is there still like, we can revive this situation?
Well, we do try to avoid the CEO sitting in a hearing in Capitol Hill. That's pretty far down the line. Yeah. That initial congressional letter is relatively, I don't mean to say meaningless, because of course Congress is very important, but that happens for everything. You will get a letter from Congress on every topic under the sun that hits the news from somebody. And so I think that's very low risk. But high risk is, of course, what we prepare CEOs for all the time, which is testifying before Congress. But we do try to also prepare by strategizing on how to avoid that.
But I think you're going to maybe another way of reacting to it is, how do you decide like when you should be using your voice to lead on a topic, when you should weigh in, when you should hope somebody else does, right? And I think, the Charlie Kirk, the pressure that companies felt to punish or fire, or however you want to articulate it, employees who were weighing in on his tragic death one way or another, was a moment that I think you would look at the companies who quickly responded to being targeted as probably not having been well served, right? So there were a lot of companies that we were working with who were following it really closely, who were getting agitation online because they would find, a tweet or a post that had been written by somebody connected to the company, and like, we're demanding action against that individual, which for all the obvious reasons, you'd have to have like Cooley on retainer if you were going to start vetting every post that any employee made. So, I think that's a place where the companies that news cycle on that dynamic of it moved very quickly. And so that's an example where I think letting things play out a little bit and letting some other people be out front probably served those who chose to just remain quiet on the topic of whether or not they were going to punish employees. That probably served them better.
I mean, the Jimmy Kimmel incident, I think, speaks to it because it is the most public, right? The most public employee who got pushed back. And, he gets pushed off the air. And I don't know if you guys saw the numbers of cancellations.
Yeah.
It was astonishing. Of course, Disney immediately reversed because I think it was in the millions, easily. And that's a lot of money you're losing because you responded to some public pressure. And not only do you kind of look like a coward, you have made a lot of people really angry because a lot of the times the people who are loudest don't necessarily represent most people. And it wasn't just Disney that did the about face, it was also the carriers. We had a blackout on the Kimmel show for a week. And then suddenly that was over. And it was because people were organizing online to start calling people who were advertising on those television channels and say, hey, I'm not going to buy from you if you're going to continue advertising here.
I mean, that's a very complicated situation, and I don't envy any decision makers in that, which is why, anytime there's such a public, such a large scale with so much money attached to it kind of crisis, everyone wants to do something. And it almost feels like pausing or reflecting is the wrong answer. But for some reason in my head, it's, maybe I'm missing something, but maybe Kelly and folks on the stage bring me in what's actually useful when you're in the thick of that kind of moment.
Listen, I hate being the person, I love the maverick CEOs. I want to work for them. I want them to be, they're also good for business because they're always getting into trouble. But, I want more of them. But I do think we're in a moment where you think about, you go through your stakeholder list that Lauren talked about. And I'm not saying you have to convene a board meeting, but sometimes on a topic that's, sensitive is not the right word, but high profile or a little outside of your traditional lane, right? Talking about earnings or your new product. It's worth taking a beat and just playing out where it goes. And we always just talk with clients about making sure you know what your off-ramp is, right? If you want to weigh in on tariffs, you should weigh in on tariffs. It's, a direct issue to your bottom line. It impacts your customers and your employees. But you should be aware enough to know that if the president jumps in with you, what's our path? What's our path to demonstrating we're going to work with him? A little scenario planning on some of this stuff can go a long way.
Yeah, I think there's also, we haven't talked about today, but there are some issues that aren't clear black or white, right? For I think every company under the sun, the Israel-Gaza conflict is probably one of the most challenging that I think any communications professional has faced, I would say, in the last couple of decades, because there was no right or wrong answer because the third and fourth order effects were so intense. But I say this not to talk about that topic. I say it because for a lot of companies, there's also a cultural context that goes beyond the United States. So what we're talking about primarily right now is U.S. response to Jimmy Kimmel, right? Tariffs, right? But for a lot of crisis management, a lot of reputational risk, it's not so black and white because a response coming out of the United States is going to be very different than a response coming out of an emerging market or a fragile country, right? Dependent on what it means to them in the context of how they are living, working, playing, and surviving. And so when you're game planning and when you're thinking about it, it's also about what does that mean beyond the walls of the US? We do that a lot right now where we're just thinking about here, but the decisions that are getting made have these ripples that are much bigger. And so the framework that I find is very helpful, at least in the current gig where I've got 189 stakeholders as countries that are in support of the World Bank Group, you have to think about what all of the shareholders think about. And so that adds another layer of complexity, but it also adds what I think is good governance and actually kind of turning the cultural Rubik's Cube and trying to figure out what does this mean in the context of kind of the broader ecosystem.
And I think it's hard to plan ahead and say, here's the statement we're going to make, here's how we're going to do X, Y, and Z. But what is critically important is to think about what's your process going to be when you're facing that decision? Who's going to be in the room? What's that hierarchy look like? How are you making decisions? who's weighing in, because planning that out ahead of time, having the team ideally have worked together before and not be meeting each other in crisis, is the core of a crisis management response, right? It is understanding that you've got the legal person and you've got your comms person, internal and usually external, that you have your government relations person, internal and often external, and that they can all work together and that they have a common understanding of the company's goals and values, and right, that is kind of the critical stage 1 point that you can plan for.
I mean, the point of this conversation right now being U.S. centric is not lost on me. It is very much something that as we're talking about the cultural dimensions of what a CEO reputation is, even the fact that a CEO has a reputation that's worth managing might in itself be an American concept to some degree, although we're starting to see a lot more celebrity CEOs across the world. But I think it's absolutely worth underscoring as a dimension we need to bring more into our advisory, especially if you're a company that is trying to expand or speak to a different market eventually, perhaps even attract talent in those markets. This is a topic we could probably do a whole other panel on, which maybe we will one day. But I did want to kind of take the last couple of moments we have to tease out some of the contradictions that I still feel are here. And this is meant to be, in some ways, by design, a very difficult, generalizable way of talking about executive reputation. So, there's such an advantage that we've talked about with having a superstar celebrity. Like you said, I mean, you want CEOs to take risks because it is an asset in some ways, like Elon Musk or all those folks we just talked about. But then there's the unintended audience problem that you sometimes get. So, and this is a question for maybe Kelly or Liz or both. How do you balance that? I mean, what's the new, for someone who's not a CEO that has a following on LinkedIn or Twitter or any of these accounts, they're just a CEO trying to do their job. Should they worry about visibility? Should they be out there trying to build a brand suddenly and have a voice, or is it okay for them to just sit it out?
I think it shouldn't be part of their you can count on one hand the number of CEOs who probably have somebody really dedicated to their brand and really futzing about it and worrying about it. Most CEOs are just trying to, like the rest of us, get through the day and deliver for their stakeholders. But I think having a presence that you cultivate and control does matter for communicating to your stakeholders. I don't think it has to be overmanaged, but in a world where there's just not enough Liz's giving thoughtful coverage to companies, I think companies and CEOs have to invest more in their own platforms so that they can tell their stories, because I just don't have enough there aren't enough reporters anymore to give thoughtful coverage to as many clients as we have. So we have to come up with different ways to tell that story. And you can't all of a sudden decide one morning to wake up and have an impact on LinkedIn if you haven't updated your LinkedIn profile and you're a CEO in 4 years, right? I have CEOs who want to do that. They're like, I want to jump on into this, and they're going to be speaking to their mom and their trainer, so it's not going to have the impact they want. So I don't think you have to be thoughtful about it, but I don't think it should be over managed, or I don't think a CEO should think about themselves as a brand. I just think it's part of their job to have these different platforms that they can leverage to communicate through.
I think that's wise. The other thing that I'll say is that I generally find, and this keeps me in a job, that people don't know when to shut up. They just don't. And that includes lawyers, by the way. I've done investigations where I've received legal threats, and they were funny, and I printed them. I'm not kidding. I have quoted letters that were threatening to sue me because they wanted to shut me up, because that's something that builds credibility with my audience. It tells you that I'm not afraid of legal consequences. That's how strong my reporting is. And so as you're thinking about these things, it is really difficult to balance because you do want to be authentic, you do want to be communicating, so you have this platform when you need it, but you need to know, like, okay, this is not the time to talk.
Yeah. With the last couple of 2.5 minutes that we have left, I'm putting all of you on like the hot spot. You got to be really quick and tell the audience, given this kind of, I think we've basically touched every sensitive topic we could have in this one conversation. So everyone take a deep breath, exhale. We're good. What's your advice for one parting tool in your toolkit that every executive or their team needs to have in order to navigate perhaps the rest of this year and 2026? So maybe we can start with you, Kelly, and then we'll work this way over.
Outstanding advisors to assist, a good law firm. No, I mean, I think for me it really is being thoughtful about you need to care about your LinkedIn profile. You need to have a place that if you want to weigh in on a topic, you can do so thoughtfully. And I think one thing we kind of skipped by, but I'd be curious, Liz, your reaction. I mean, I think when you think about what to do in these viral moments, like the people who just jump in and say, I was a jerk, I was wrong, I didn't understand it, I'm sorry. Like, I think so much of communications is just going back to all like what our moms taught us about just being good humans. And I think for some reason, some leaders have a hard time with that. But the people who have messed up, I think they get a lot of credibility from reporters when they just say, it's not so interesting a story to you. No. Once they just say, my bad, I'm sorry, I was a jerk. I got it wrong. And then Liz doesn't really have a story to write anymore. And if you don't have a platform to make the apology, to provide the context, to give the explanation, you're kind of losing an opportunity.
Someone in the room who will say no. I think the modern day CEO, to surround yourself with yes people who will just, when you feel the need to talk, will run up to your office with a camera and just hold it. I think that is the ultimate reputation risk. Surrounding yourself with somebody who you trust enough and who you've given enough access to your thoughts, your strategy, your how you want to move the company forward, to be willing to say, I'm going to make you my constructive dissent in the room. There's nothing more critical.
I love that.
I couldn't agree more. I think having that, like, I would just add like diverse perspectives in that room, people representing the different constituencies that you're speaking to, people who are really thinking about it from that perspective, people who are thinking about it from both kind of the legal and the brand and the government, like from all of those different perspectives in the room, and then having them willing to really speak up and say, hey, why don't we take a pause? Maybe this isn't, like, let's think through the risks that are involved here and the pluses and the minuses, play it out, take a breath and think, this is something that we think is so important, we really want to do it, or we have to do it, versus this is something where we think it's time to not, right?
I think the thing that we're talking about here is the moment where you suddenly have this unintended audience, right? Like that's what being viral is that you were going about your business and then all of a sudden the entire internet focused on you. And so it's hard to know when that's going to happen or why it might happen. I mean, there are influencers who cultivate this and they do a lot of work to get there, but the rest of us, you know, it's scary and it's a surprise. And so just being aware that there is a possibility that you are speaking to a much larger audience than just your shareholders or just members of Congress or whoever else, that the general public is out there, I think goes a really long way.
Well, I think that we've learned a lot in this conversation. Why don't we give it up for our wonderful panelists? Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Such a good
This
job.
is so
Great
wonderful.
discussion.
I'll walk you guys this way.